All right, here we are on the third heading, which is global problems. I'm going to talk to you about population pressures and environmental degradation. So we're in the midst of what's called the J curve, which is a huge explosion in population. See, what happened is that from it took up through human history up to about 1800 for there to be 1 billion people. And ever since then, it's been just shooting up exponentially. So it creates a J. Actually, from this side, from the camera, I guess this is what it would look like. Anyway, so there's a lot of people. So like I said, at 1800, we had about 1 billion people. 1900, we had 1.7 billion. 1950, 2.5. Now you'll notice that the more people you have, the quicker the population jumps. At 1975, we're at about 4 billion. 2005, right before your birth, about 6.5 billion. So if you ever talk to anybody who's over 30 and they don't know exactly how many people are on the planet, be kind, because it's changed several times in their lifetime. So, and you're used to, ever since you've been conscious, there being 7 billion people. But as I look on the internet, so it must be true, we're at 7.858279799. I'm sorry, now we're up to 8. So anyway, round up, we're at 7.9 billion. So that means in a little bit, you're going to have to remember that 8 billion people are on the planet. Now, that causes some concerns. And clearly, what's going on here is geographers and social scientists have created this thing called the demographic transition model. What we've noticed is as countries industrialize, what happens is at first birth rates and death rates are pretty high. And then as we industrialize, death rates tend to drop. And that's usually has to do with sanitation, better science, better vaccines, antibiotics, stuff like that. Okay. And then what ends up happening is that, and what happens is so we have this increase with the birth rate staying high and the death rate is dropping. So to get stability, you need a replacement rate of 2. And what we're noticing is in lesser developed countries, that number is usually much higher than that, which causes a lot of population growth. Okay, so now I'll get to kind of the goods and bads about that. But one of the things that people really are concerned about is the planet's carrying capacity. How many people is too much for the planet before things collapse on themselves? So, and some people argue that we're already in the midst of an extinction event, that we have too many people and we need drastic changes now, or things are going to get really bad in the next few decades. So, now, some people aren't listening to them because we've got some groups like this, like the Club of Rome, which was started in '67, which attempted to really kind of think of the economic and political, social, all the issues around huge population growth. And we'll see, like in '72 was their first big writing, the limits to growth. And then what ends up happening is they have the limits of growth, and then let's see here. Another one is Warning to Humanity. Before that, they have something called Beyond the Limits. I don't know why I'm on the Club of Rome's website right now, and they say they published that in '88. So I'm gonna believe the Club of Rome versus your textbook. But anyway, what's happened is that they've realized that what they've talked about is the potential disaster that could happen. And although things have been moving in a bad direction, they haven't gotten as bad as that. And so today, the Club of Rome, again, on their website right now, they don't talk a lot about population as much as they do about other big crises that are happening on the planet. And I'll talk about that in just a second. You see, because one of the issues is the environmental impact that this many people have on the planet. Obviously, there's issues with could be natural resources. And one of the issues we're fighting with right now is everybody wants a better life. Everyone wants to have the best conveniences. The way we're doing it now is not sustainable. Like, there is not enough resources for everybody on the planet to have a cell phone right now. Very interesting side note. We are running out of sand, which I know sounds crazy, but things like glass, but to a much greater extent, things like microchips. It's made out of silicon. Silicon is something that, it does have a limit on the planet. And so the issue is are we going to have enough natural resources for people to be able to live? On top of that, we also have this issue of pollution. So, the issues of the stuff that's created from industrialization, all the different pollution that's created, and so that is an issue. And so we're having issues with animal species being either going extinct or being threatened to be extinct, both on land and in the sea. Another big thing that we need to talk about is global warming, which is which appears to be, which is scientifically is happening. Now, whether you want to call it climate change or global warming, I'm just going to talk about global warming right now. So the science of what we do know is we do know that some of the things we emit um, are gases that once they're in the atmosphere, the sun's rays comes down. As they bounce off the planet, normally it just bounces off and goes off into space. What happens is when you have an excess of these gases, what ends up happening is that the sun hits the earth, bounces back up, and gets trapped. And so that's why they're called greenhouse gases, because it kind of turns the earth into a greenhouse. Now, kind of like with the population thing I mentioned with Club of Rome, some people have a hard time, people older than me tend to have a hard time believing in this because they've heard all the stuff of like Club of Rome, which hasn't necessarily come to true. And then also, you weren't alive for it, and they were pretty hokey. But in the 80s and 90s, we had all these series of, sometimes on network TV, these specials about how the world is doomed because of global warming, and they keep pushing back the goalposts. They said, oh yeah, by 2000 we'll see this, and it's going to be horrible, and those markers are made. Or like 2020 will be like this, and the thing is at this point we're starting to see the lowest bars of what they say is going to happen. We start to see that we're seeing polar ice caps starting to melt at alarming rates. We see we've lost one nation so far. There's a second nation which we might be losing because of the rising sea levels. But again, for some people, it's a really hard sell. So Kyoto was the first place, and then we had another Paris. We had another meeting in Paris to try to have nations decide to curb their greenhouse gases. But again, as you may know from the news, we have some people who believe that's not nearly enough, and so that's still an ongoing issue, especially as we have some countries desperate to industrialize, and that can cause huge issues. So the issue becomes, okay, again, if we're concerned about carrying capacity and we have these huge birth rates, what do we do about population control? And those have been very divisive political issues. I've talked about India in the last chapter on how they did some forced sterilizations. China had the one-child policy, which in some ways kind of slowed. They're still a major nation, but the other issue is that with the one-child policy, what's happened is they now have a gender inequity. So it's not monstrous, but it is a discernible difference in how many men versus women there are, which could cause even huger issues down the line. And so one thing that's interesting, though, that your book doesn't really talk about is that we know there are ways we can kind of force birth rates to go down. But the big issue, it might actually be on the other end. So your book really doesn't talk about it, but just so you know, there are countries which are having issues because they are shrinking. They aren't having enough children. Again, and that's part of that demographic transition model I told you at the beginning. So what happens is birth rates are high, death rates are high. You industrialize, that death rate goes down. As you keep industrializing, eventually your birth rate goes down as you get into like a service economy. What happens is that it becomes your life becomes more difficult having children. Before children were an economic boon. You made more money. Your life was easier to have kids and as many as you could. In today's society, as you'd imagine, life is very expensive for people. And so having children is a choice. It's a wonderful choice. I love my daughter, and I'm sure your parents love you. However, it's an economic choice you have to make, and you have to give some stuff up because of it. So one of the things that will happen, again, not in your book, but one of the things that's going to be an issue in your lifetime will be, hey, are we not having enough people? And And again, we'll see what happens with that. On to the next section.